In this video, we will show you how to replace your power steering pressure line on this Mercury Grand Marquis between the year range of 2003 to 2011. The power steering pressure line is located underneath the vehicle along the front next to your power steering rack. Okay friends, let's get started on our job. There's a couple things we need to mention before we get into it. You're going to be dealing with power steering fluid, which is a chemical. Make sure you're wearing hand and eye protection at all times. You also need to get underneath the front of the vehicle, so you want to make sure you're in a safe and level surface. Aside from that, we're going to come right over here to the power steering reservoir. You can go ahead and lift this up, give it a quick inspection, and set that cap aside. The fluid that you will be using inside of this is Mercon 5 ATF, or transmission fluid. If you don't have Mercon 5, you can also use universal transmission fluid. Now with all that, we can make our way underneath the front of the vehicle. When you get underneath this, if you have to safely raise and support it, and you're lifting up the rear as well, if you're going to be lifting all four wheels up off the ground, make sure that you disengage the air ride suspension in the trunk. Since I'll be working with all four wheels off the ground, I'll make sure I switch this off. Now let's make our way underneath the vehicle. You're going to locate your power steering pressure hose, and you'll find right along your crank pulley an 11mm nut. Loosen that nut. We'll just give that a quick inspection and put it on just a couple threads. That way there, this bracket is nice and loose. Now that we have that nut on there, continue on to putting a collection bucket underneath this area. We're going to have to remove our oil filter for this job. We'll use our large oil filter wrench for this, turn it counterclockwise to remove it from the area. Now once this stops trickling oil down into this area, continue on to removing the little funnel from the power steering pressure line. For this, there's an area that you can grab onto and slide it out of place, dislodging it, and then you can remove it from the area. Once this is out of here, we'll use some parts cleaner and clean everything down. We've got our funnel here, we'll clean that, and the power steering rack, especially up where the power steering line goes into the rack. Once the area is cleaned down, you're going to be looking for this area right up here. There's a 10mm headed bolt that holds the line in place to the power steering rack. Remove that bolt and the line. As we remove this, keep in mind there is power steering fluid inside these lines. Have your collection bucket under the area. Inspect your hardware. Go ahead and grab onto those lines, give them a little wiggle to break them free from the power steering rack. Swing this right out of the way. There we are. Now at this point, I'll bring this down into my collection bucket so I can start draining the fluid as I continue. Once that line's out of there, continue on to the other line. We'll just pop this up and out of here so it's out of the way. Let that drain out the fluid. Okay, at this point, we can follow that power steering pressure line all the way up to the power steering pump right up here. What you'll find is you have to use a short 18mm wrench to remove this. The fitting itself is pretty close to that power steering pump pulley. It shouldn't be in the way. You could just work around it. I'll use my short 18mm wrench for this. There we are. Now let's make our way back over to that bracket and remove that 11mm nut. Slide the power steering hose off of the bracket. And there it is, friends. Now over on the bench, it's going to be time to take this bracket off of our power steering pressure line. You'll find on one side of the bracket you have a tab that protrudes out and it's peened over. We need to hold the line still and continue on by prying this up, straightening it out, so we can pull this off and transfer it over to the brand new power steering pressure line. You can either use a vise or just have a second person help you out. Now we can turn this over and pry this out. We'll remove this as well. Give this a quick inspection. Make sure it doesn't look like it's torn, worn, or damaged in any way. Assuming all this looks good, let's transfer it over to the brand new power steering line. Let's get this transferred over. Continue on to your bracket. Once you put this on the line, we're going to have to try to crimp this together, putting this area into that hole. Once it's in the proper positioning, you have to peen it over so it's locked in place. We'll use some pliers. Now, while I'm holding this, I'll peen this over. Perfect. Now let's make our way back to the original power steering pressure line to remove our plastic bracket from the area. On this plastic bracket, what you want to pay attention to is inside of this area. There's going to be a little tab that's angled. Use a small flathead screwdriver, carefully get into that area, give it a little twist, and then stick another screwdriver inside this slot to gently separate it without breaking it. Sometimes it pops apart easily without even having to use the second screwdriver. Now that we have this one separated, you'll find that you have a second one inside this area. This one's easier to access from the other side. For this one, I'll use a smaller screwdriver to make my way inside there. There we are. Let's transfer this over to the new line. Get this in position, latch it in. Now we can get over to the vehicle. All right, let's get ready for our installation. We'll take this and slide it in position, up along that bracket. Once you have it up there, continue on with that mounting nut. We're only going to start this on. Leave it loose, and then we'll continue on. Let's take our small O-ring and put that over the line. Once you've done that, continue on to putting this into the power steering rack You also want to put the other line into the rack, and then we'll slide this bracket into place and install our mounting bolt. That slides right in. Clean and inspect your other line. If that O-ring has to be replaced, now's the time to do it. Make sure that that bracket sits in the groove on that other power steering line. Install your mounting bolt. Once you have that bottomed out, torque it to 150 inch-pounds. Now we can start attaching the power steering pressure line to the power steering pump. When you're doing this, you'll find that it's a little bit difficult to try to turn this fitting by hand, which is typically how you'd want to start something in. So with that said, try to get it lined up as flat as possible and continue on with your 18mm wrench. While you're snugging this, make sure it doesn't feel like there's very much resistance. Basically saying, make sure you're not cross-threading it into the power steering pump. Now as you're tightening this, the torque for it should be 54 foot-pounds. It's pretty clear that it's hard to get a torque wrench on this, but as long as you make it nice and tight, it should be good to go. Now we can make our way over to the power steering pressure line bracket, snug this up, and then torque it to 71 inch-pounds. Now while we're over here, pay attention to this area on your power steering pressure line. If your vehicle is equipped with a power steering pressure sensor, that's where it would go. Ours is not. With the power steering pressure line, you're going to find that it came with this little cap. Make sure it has an O-ring on it and install it. Make sure it's nice and snug. I'll use a 19mm wrench to hold the line and a 13mm wrench to tighten the plug. It's bottomed out. Make it snug. Now it's time to reinstall our oil filter. Before you do, make sure you clean down the base on the engine where the oil filter will sit. If you're reusing your old oil filter, make sure you wipe down the seal on that as well. Let's get that filter on here. We'll use our oil filter wrench to make sure this is nice and tight. Typically, once it's bottomed out, another half a turn should do it. Let's clean down our mess. Now we can put this in here. Slide it into position. There we go. Now before we slide out from underneath the vehicle, just double check everything. We know we tightened everything as needed and we cleaned up our mess. Let's make our way back out from underneath the vehicle. With the front wheels still off the ground, let's continue filling our power steering system. Let's have a look at our fluid reservoir here. You can see that you have a maximum line where my index finger is. You want to pay attention to that while we fill this up. So as we fill it, we only want to go up to the line. Once you've done that, you're going to have to put the key in the on position without the vehicle running and turn that steering wheel from side to side several times. You'll find that the air starts making its way up and out and the fluid makes its way down. While we continue doing that, make sure you continue topping off the fluid along the way. Once again, for doing this, you want to make sure that you're using Mercon 5 ATF, that's transmission fluid. You can also use universal if that's what you have access to. Now that we pre-bled the power steering system, the next thing that you want to do is have your car on a level surface. Start it up, let it run for approximately 5 seconds and turn it right back off. We're going to make our way along the driver's side. Just underneath this air inlet, you'll find the oil dipstick. Check that oil level. Make sure it's up to par. If it needs to be added to, add a little bit of 5W20 oil. We'll just wipe this off. Now, as you're inspecting the oil level, you want to pay attention to these 2 dots and the hatches in between. Anywhere in between the hatches is a good sign. Closer to that top dot is where you want to be. Okay, at this point, I turn the wheel from side to side several times, forcing out as much air from inside the power steering system as possible. Go ahead and start up the vehicle. You're going to want to let it run for a little while. What you'll find is typically you're going to see a couple more air bubbles making its way out. That's a good sign. That means we're flushing out the air in the system. Once you're sure that you don't see any more air bubbles, make sure you're up to par at the maximum line and then put on your power steering cap. Okay, we ran it. There's no more air coming out of there. We'll reinstall this cap and make sure that it's secured. Let's quickly look underneath the vehicle and double check for leaks real quick. Pay attention to where your pressure line goes into that power steering pump. Where the pressure line goes into the power steering rack. Double check that oil filter to make sure you don't see any oil there. And then follow this all the way over to the other side where you either have your power steering pressure sensor or the plug that you had installed. Assuming all that looks good, go ahead and make your way back out from underneath the vehicle. With the vehicle back down safely on the ground, flip the switch in the trunk for your air ride suspension. All right, shut your trunk and hood and then take it for a road test. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.